I'm here in the Lowestoft Cemetery next to the Cross of Sacrifice. During the First World War, Lowestoft was a trawler base with a minesweeping officer in command, and during the Second World War was a central depot for the Royal Navy Patrol Service, which was developed from the pre-war Royal Naval Reserve trawler section. After the war, this Cross of Sacrifice was erected on island site in honour of all the servicemen buried in the cemetery. Most of 1939 45 graves are in one of the 4 war grave plots, 3 of which are in the western part of the cemetery and 1 to the east of the main entrance. The remainder are in other parts of the cemetery. There are 95 Commonwealth burials in the 1914-18 war and 122 burials of the 1939-45 war commemorated in this site. Of these, 11 are unidentified seamen of the Merchant Navy and 2,385 sailors of the Royal Naval Patrol Service, only known graves at the sea. There are also 11 German war burials here and 2 non-war service burials. All of these brave souls who came from ordinary backgrounds, just like you and me, but when the call came, did their duty for their country.
Here are buried 11 unidentified merchant navymen from World War II, and I suspect most of them are crewmen from the SS Royal Crown. The Royal Crown was attacked and set on fire in the North Sea by German aircraft on the 30th of January 1940 during the so-called Phoney War. The crew abandoned ship, but 1 of the 2 lifeboats overturned in the surf, and 7 of the crew drowned. The other lifeboat was never found, and I suspect that some of the unidentified men are from that. It's interesting to note that some of the crew on board who are buried here were actually from the Middle East.
Sergeant Jack Waller was a victim of a tragic friendly fire incident. On the 3rd of June 1942, the Havoc night fighter he was radar operator in was shot down by their own flight commander, who mistook it for a German Do-217 bomber. His pilot, Flight Sergeant Tom Gibbs, bailed out, but Jack Waller was killed. His parents were the Wallers of restaurateur fame, and whose premises in London Road North were destroyed in the town's worst raid of the war on the 13th of January 1942. Air Craftsman Second Class William Dye was probably the very first Lowestoft man to be killed on active service in World War II. Willie Dye was a ground crewman, and he was killed when the Wellington bomber he was flying as a passenger in crashed in Norfolk on the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day in 1939. All 7 crew, which included a Beccles man, were killed, but the real tragedy of Willie Dye's death is written on the headstone. He was killed on his 19th birthday.
This is the grave of Harriet Crisp, the wife of Thomas Crisp. Thomas was killed on board his armed trawler Nelson after it was attacked and sunk by a German submarine on the 15th of August 1917. Despite being mortally wounded, Tom continued to engage the submarine, which enabled his crew to escape in a small boat. Tom went down with his ship and his body was never found. He is memorialised here on his wife's gravestone. In recognition of his bravery, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Another Lowestoft man to receive a posthumous VC was Sergeant Claude Castleton. While fighting in France with the Australian Machine Gun Corps, under intense fire, he was killed while rescuing his wounded comrades from no man's land. He is buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Pozières in France. In total, there are 234 Commonwealth war graves in this cemetery. Most of them are in this section, but others are scattered elsewhere. In Kirkley Cemetery, there are another 62 war graves, and in St Margaret's Church, there are yet another 19. Here we are standing in the mainly First World War section. In the distance are the graves from the Second World War. There are 95 Commonwealth war graves from the 1914-18 war, Among this number, 24 trawlers and 9 drifters are noted, manned mainly by local Royal Naval Reserve men. These reflect the contribution to the war made by local fishermen. 186 civilian victims of air raids from Lowestoft are recorded on the Commonwealth War Graves website, but not all of them are buried in Lowestoft Cemetery. The youngest civilian buried here is 7 months old Norman John Barnard of Alton Village. He's the son of Lily Maud Barnard. He died on the 27th of May 1941, together with his mother and grandfather. In total, there were 19 children and teenagers killed in the air raids. The oldest civilian is 85-year-old Benjamin William Cheek and his 84 years old wife Annie, who died when their house was bombed on London Road South on the 27th of February 1941.
It was a sound idea to take shelter in wartime, but nothing would save you in the event of a direct hit on your shelter. Sadly, that is exactly what happened to the people in this grave, the Clark family. 5 of them, the oldest 62, the youngest 15, and 3 members of the Barnard family, including a 2-year-old girl, were killed when a high explosive bomb hit their Anderson shelter in Rotterdam Road, not too far from where we're standing, on the 9th of April 1941. All of these first 7 graves in the front row, 5 Royal Navy sailors and 2 Wrens, Women's Royal Naval Service, were all victims of the infamous Waller's Raid on the 13th of January 1942. Roy Penfold was only 19. Laura Besant was a Lowestoft lady. There are 11 German graves here in Lowestoft, which makes it the biggest group of German war graves in Suffolk. 7 of them were washed up or recovered at sea, but 4 of them are the crew of a Junkers 88 bomber which was shot down over the town and crashed in an area known as the Church Fields. 2 of the bombs the aircraft was carrying exploded, and this is the result, a collective grave with 2 stones bearing 4 names. In the early 1960s, the majority of German war dead were transferred to Cannock Chase in Staffordshire, but Lowestoft Borough Council refused to give permission, and so they remain. Out of all the war graves in Lowestoft, this is the one that fascinates me the most. Yes, he was serving under the swastika for Nazi Germany, but for 75 years this young man was buried as an unknown German serviceman, and now he has an identity and a new headstone. Now, I've met some of the relatives of this man, Eberhard Pleiss, and I'd just like to say this. It means a lot to these people to know that their family members are buried in a plot where they are looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. A lot. Frantisek Hawkey is the only Czech serviceman buried in Lowestoft. His story is a very tragic one. He was a keen pre-war radio ham, so when he escaped to England via France in 1940, he was perhaps unsurprisingly trained as a wireless operator air gunner with 311 Squadron, the very first Czech bomber squadron with RAF Bomber Command. He flew 7 operations with that squadron, but he was not a happy man. He was often openly critical of the Czech authorities in Britain and his superiors in the military, to the point where he became the subject of a scheduled military court-martial. He transferred to the Free Czech Army as a 2nd lieutenant, and it was whilst based in Lowestoft as a duty officer he decided to take matters into his own hands, and he took his own life with a service revolver. But for me, the futility of the war in terms of lives lost is summed up by 2 graves at the back of the War Graves plot. Right in the corner is the grave of Robert Dietrich, who was a Kriegsmarine or German Navy sailor, killed out in the North Sea in one of the last actions of the war on the 7th of April 1945, only a month before the war in Europe ended. Robert Dietrich was killed aboard one of the E-boats lost in action and brought ashore for burial. And just a short distance away is signalman Doug Chudley, who was a crewman aboard MTB 494, which was rammed and sunk by an E-boat that very same night. If I was asked to sum it all up, I'd quote something that a former Luftwaffe pilot, Heinz Merlenbrook, said when he visited these graves in 1997. He said, "This community of graves, Commonwealth graves and German graves, this more than anything else shows the nonsense of war." And I think you have to agree, he was absolutely right.
Unfortunately, we will not behold the service of remembrance this year, but at 11 a.m. wherever you are, we can still observe the 2-minute silence and say a prayer for these brave personnel who will never be forgotten.